My name is Hannah Jane Radcliffe. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Cleveland, Ohio, in a small brick house that smells like coffee and lemon cleaner most mornings. For as long as I can remember, my life has been a collection of other people's demands stitched over my own quiet wishes. Raising my younger brother, keeping my mother's secrets, answering to a town that thinks good girls don't ask questions. Right now, I'm supposed to be beginning the one thing I thought would change everything. Marriage. But if you're here for a simple, happily ever after, I have to warn you, this is not that. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. The church was a white clapboard relic sitting at the corner of Maple and 3rd, paint peeling in places, wooden pews softened by generations of elbows, and steeple birds that left neat constellations of droppings on the roof. It was raining in a thin, stubborn way the morning of my wedding, the kind of rain that smelled like wet asphalt and the lemon bouquets we'd chosen for their stubborn cheerfulness. I remember the way the lilies looked under the dim, stained glass light, ivory like teeth or promises, and how I wanted those petals to mean something permanent. People imagine weddings through filtered photos. Perfect hair, exact smiles. My wedding was noisy in the way real life is. My Aunt Edna's perfume cutting the air too sharp, my brother Aaron tugging at my veil, my hands shaking because I couldn't find the words to tell my stomach to stop feeling like someone had knotted it. The inside of my dress was stitched with a small blue ribbon sewn by my mother years ago for my first school dance. I kept it there because it felt right to carry something old into something that was supposed to be new. Mark Hale stood at the altar with the kind of suit that fit too well, like it had been tailored by someone who wore money like a second skin. He had the habit of tilting his head when he listened, like the world were a dial and he was trying to pick up a frequency. That's what drew me to him at first. The way he made space for me to speak and the way he returned my small jokes with something like laughter. He'd been steady in a town where steadiness was rare. He was, or so I thought, a promise against the erosion of my life. Our families were a tangle of agreements and absences. My father, when he showed up, smelled of cigarettes and the regret that had etched itself into his voice. My mother no one could find, but her absence was a steady bruise I kept tucked behind the breath. My sister Lucy, my oldest, the one who had left, was my maid of honor. That fact alone should have felt wrong the way a splinter under a fingernail does, but I convinced myself that people leave and come back and that people can make up for lost time in the space between a bouquet toss and the reception. The ceremony was held by Father Thomas, the parish priest who had a voice like a slow train and a way of looking at you that felt like being measured against an old, familiar truth. He had baptized me, we'd always joked, though the last confession I'd given him was a promise not to tell my neighbor that she liked the wrong kind of houseplants. He stood at the pulpit with a little pile of well-worn papers and a face that read solemn like the weather. The church hummed with a low buzz of fluorescent lights and whispered prayers. Some of them for us, some of them for weather, some of them for things we didn't want to say out loud. When I reached the altar, heart a staccato drum, Mark took my hands. He smelled like cedar and the thin citrus cologne he wore when he wanted to seem young. For a second the rest of the world flattened into the ring, the vows, the rhythm we had practiced in his living room with a cheap speaker on the table. I remember thinking in the gentlest possible way, this is it. Then Mark looked at me and said, loud enough for the whole church to hear, you're just a placeholder. The sound of that statement dropped into the room like a stone. It's strange how time does that. 1 second you're standing in a place you were supposed to be, and the next the ground has unlatched and you're falling through a sentence that shouldn't exist. The choir stopped mid-note. My brother made a sound like a small animal been caught. Aunt Edna's perfume suddenly smelled like a crime scene. My knees felt hollowed out as though someone had swept them clean of meaning. Mark. Father Thomas's voice was a soft reprimand at first, like a hand on a shoulder, but then it hardened. There was a moment of that kind of silence you can feel physically, like a pressure in your ears. Smiles melted into mouths that didn't know what to say. I remember the lilies looking suddenly too white, like actors pretending to be alive. My hands, that had been splayed in his, tensed until I could feel my knuckles white under the thin lace. The congregation murmured, a rustle of feathers. My mother did not appear. I had no mother to reach for in that second. Lucy's face went as still as a photograph. Mark's jaw worked as if chewing something inedible. He looked as if he had said something and wasn't sure why it came into the air. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I didn't know then whether I was going to laugh, to run, to faint. I did not want to cause a scene, and yet I also could not stand for water to be poured on the last dry part of me. The wedding I had rehearsed in my head had not included public humiliation. "You're what?" My brother's voice was small but threaded with something raw. "I'm sorry," Mark said and then repeated quieter to me. "It's just a placeholder." The way he said it was like throwing a shard of glass and watching it find its necessary depth. When your life tilts, you try to cling to something. I clung to the ritual, to the idea that a ceremony is a net. Father Thomas's face shifted, not the mild priestly concern, but a fierce, protective brightness I could not have expected. He inhaled, and when he spoke the words had the gravity of one who had held many confessions in his hands. "I think," he said to everyone, "that some things should not be allowed to break someone in front of a congregation." He walked down the aisle slowly, each step like a decision. I felt the eyes of the town on my back, on the thin skin of my life. And then, in a voice that seemed to move the very air between the pews, Father Thomas said, "There are truths I was asked to keep. But I cannot be party to cruelty disguised as duty." He reached into his coat. My heart throttled. What was he wearing under his robes? He produced a small envelope, damp from the rain. He looked at me with a gentleness that made me want to kneel and weep on the carpet. "Before I read this," he said, "Hannah, this is not how you deserve to know. I think a lot of you already know the shape of betrayal by now. How it feels to discover a life built on something you were never told. But there is a cruelty in discovery at the altar, in front of people who will gossip for a decade about how you smelled of lilies and humiliation." I felt my brother Aaron gripping the edge of the pew, his fingers whitening. Lucy's lips moved like a person trying to read a map with no landmarks. Father Thomas cleared his throat. "This was entrusted to me by your sister Lucy," he said. "She asked me to give it to you if—" He paused, and for a sliver of time I thought the world was holding its breath. "If you were ever told you were anything less than cherished. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything." The envelope in his hand seemed small and ordinary, but it held something that would unravel the people closest to me. It felt like the church had become an interrogation room where light revealed more than it was meant to. I looked at Mark and saw no malice, only exhaustion. I looked at Lucy and saw a story I had not wanted to know. When Father Thomas unfolded the paper and began to read, I realized that this wedding, my wedding, was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of excavation. I wish the memory of Father Thomas reading the letter were cinematic, like a slow pan to a tearful face with violins swelling, but that would be a lie. What I remember is that his voice sounded like someone trying to keep a steady hand while the table beneath him shook. The church's fluorescent lights hummed. Rain kept its thin, steady tattoo against the windows, as if the weather itself were reluctant to intrude on the truth that was unfolding. He read Lucy's handwriting, shaky in places, deliberate in others, the kind of script that suggested someone who had rehearsed confessions in the dark. "Hannah," he read aloud, "I am so sorry. I owe you the truth, though it hurts both of us. I was young and scared. Aaron is mine, and Mark is his father. Mark and I, were together when we were 18. When the pregnancy came, I couldn't keep him. Our families were small-town smart. There were debts and threats, and choices were made for us. I gave Aaron to you to raise because I thought it was best. I thought you deserved a chance. I thought I could fix it later. I can't watch you be made a prop for what I've done." The words landed like a series of small detonations. My throat closed. For years I'd believed that Aaron was my kid brother, my small person to protect. He had been and is a little boy with skinned knees and a laugh like the first ring of a bell. I had wiped his face, been at every parent-teacher conference, and patched up the quiet places in him my sister had abandoned. The idea that he wasn't just my brother but the child of the man I stood before turned every assumption I had about my past into questions. People make choices for other people all the time in small towns. Arranged favors disguised as sacrifice, favors repaid as obligations. My father had owed money. There had been whispered deals about who would marry whom. Lucy had always been an excellent negotiator in the ways that are taught when you have to survive on charm and flight. She had left once and apparently could not return without making the world tolerate her sin. I read the letter again in slow motion in my mind while the room rotated like a carousel. Waterspouts of rumor began to form in people's faces. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, but Lucy was already standing, face raw as if she'd been carved. She looked older than her 36 years, like someone who'd had to keep secrets as a second job. "I thought it would keep him safe," she said, voice rough. "And you, God, I thought you deserved a life. I thought Aaron would be better here than anywhere else." "And the marriage?" Father Thomas demanded gently. "What made you ask Mark's family to do this? Who spoke for whom?" Lucy faltered, then reached into her pocket and produced a wrinkled, greasy business card. "My husband's father, Donovan Hale," he called. He promised money, made it sound like he could tie loose ends. I didn't know how to say no. I thought if I could settle things no one would have to know. I thought I could come back clean. Mark's face had an expression I couldn't parse. He looked not like a man who had initiated a cruelty, but like someone who had been caught in the middle of a tide he couldn't swim against. When he finally spoke, he said, "It wasn't supposed to be like this. Donovan." He swallowed. "He told me that if I married Hannah it would settle my mother's debts and Aaron would have his name. I didn't ask to be a pawn." "Pawn," my brother Aaron repeated under his breath, old in the worry that had furrowed his brow for years. He looked at me, at Mark, then at Lucy like a small judge trying to parse adult law. Later, when Aaron was only 12 and had been told that his mother had left because she thought it would be better for him, he'd often said, "Hannah's the best," as if it were a broken record he played for reassurance. I felt something akin to rage and a drowning grief at once. "Why tell her now?" I demanded. That was directed at Lucy and the letter like a sharpened name. A million little answers clustered in the air. Cowardice, shame, fear of scandal, the kind of inertia that keeps people repeating harmful patterns. Lucy's fingers twitched. "Because," she said finally, "because I couldn't let them use you the way they wanted to." I thought. She stopped as if the rest of the justification would sound like the very thing she had done. Father Thomas folded the letter. The congregation was no longer a neutral audience. They had become witnesses. People leaned forward like spectators at a collision. The line between public ritual and private life had snapped. "Donovan Hale is Mark's father," Father Thomas said, and the name hit like an accusation. My mind supplied 1,000 images. Donovan in a pressed suit, a smell of expensive tobacco, ledger books with numbers that had nothing to do with kindness. My father had owed him money when I was young. Deals get made in small towns to settle debts and keep reputations tidy. What happened is that tidy often comes at the expense of someone else's truth. Mark's mouth twitched. "My father told me we would do something responsible. I didn't want to hurt you," he said, and then the words came jagged and half-explained. "I thought it would be a way to make things right for Aaron. He wanted a name, legitimacy, and my family, my father, said marriage would do it." "That's not your choice to make," I said. I surprised myself with the heat in my voice. Standing there, the dress felt like armor that failed. Around us, the guests shifted awkwardly, but some looked almost vindictive, as if they'd been waiting for scandal like a season. Someone in the back tried to laugh, but it sounded like a choke. "Father Thomas," I said, "why are you reading this here? Why not later? Why a public reading?" He met my eyes, and in his gaze there was something I had not expected. An old, priestly compassion, and an understanding of how cruelties done in the name of duty only serve to hurt the most vulnerable. "Because," he said softly, "it seemed to me there is a point at which secrets are weapons, and they needed to be lifted so they could no longer be used." After the reading ended, the church slowly became a courtroom. People took sides without deciding, and the reception downstairs, the cake, the cheap punch, felt grotesque as we went down to sort out pieces of our lives. I remember the carpet in the fellowship hall sticking to my heels, the fluorescent glare that made everyone look pallid and obvious. Conversations clicked like clock hands. Someone told me later that half the town had been poised to write this off as a family spat, but the other half looked at me with a cold blend of curiosity and judgment reserved for things that break the comfortable narrative. Mark left the hall before the cake was cut. He walked out into the rain without his coat and looked like a man who had been left to weather in the open. I wanted to go after him and slap him and beg him for answers and shove him away all in the same breath. Instead, I stayed with the people who had assembled in my small city to witness my supposed happiness and now my fall. If you're watching this and it's bringing back memories of being used or hurt by a family secret, I know how isolating that loneliness can be. Let me know in the comments. Sometimes the small act of speaking is the first step toward piecing your truth back together. The rest of that week felt like wading through a river of glass, every question cut. But the truth, once it is freed into the light, presses hard. You learn what it costs, and sometimes you learn how to refuse to pay. Those first nights after the wedding, if you can call them nights when there was no sleep, were filled with the peculiar acoustics of small-town rumor and the internal noise that secrecy makes. I slept with the window cracked open even though the nights were still cool. The sound of rain on the roof became the ruler by which I measured the coming days. I could hear every creak of the house as if it were a person moving through a conversation we were not invited to join. Lucy stayed for 2 days. The first evening she sat in my kitchen with a mug of chamomile and said, "I thought I was protecting you." She looked at me with a pleading that made me want to both reach for her and push her away. In her eyes I saw a child who had been taught to bargain for safety, and in that child I saw how she had inflicted the lesson on others, as if cruelty could be passed like a lit match. "You gave Aaron to me while telling everyone he was my brother," I said. "You let me be his guardian without telling me his mother was you. You made me a cover for your choices." Her face went tight. "I left because it was the only way I thought I'd survive. I thought if I walked away you could be safe. Our father, he owed Donovan Hale. Donovan threatened us. He said if things weren't settled, he would take the house, take Aaron, take the rest. He painted pictures of ruin. I thought I could save us. By lying. Yes. By letting my life be handed over like a thing." She flinched. "I thought you could forgive me later." I thought. Later. Echoed. Later is not a thing you can cash in. It's not a currency you can spend to buy someone back. There was a thread of abuse running through our family's story that finally, painfully, became visible. My father hadn't just owed money. He had been cornered by men who used fear like leverage. Sometimes saving yourself meant embedding someone else deeper into the harm. That is a hard thing to face. My sister's choices had been made under duress, but they had real consequences. Aaron, who was 12 and already building his own wary adult, sat on the floor in the living room and listened as if to an old radio that only he could hear. When he met my eyes, I saw no accusation, only a kind of small, stunned curiosity, like a child who had just learned the rules of a game were not what he'd been told. He came to me later that night and whispered, "Hannah, is Mark my father?" I knelt and hugged him and felt the little muscles in his back tense and release. "Yes," I said. "He's your father." Saying it aloud felt like closing a seam that had been left open for years. "But you are my brother too. Nothing changes how loved you are." We ran tests. It was invasive and slow and scientific and strangely ordinary in the face of the emotional hurricane. A sterile swab, a labeled envelope, a waiting room that smelled of coffee and magazines. When the results came back 2 weeks later, they matched with the bureaucratic indifference of a government office. Aaron's DNA was consistent with Mark's at levels that admitted no argument. It wasn't a revelation anymore. It was a fact on paper. Mark came back then. He had spent nights at his father's house, and in our small-town gossip is a hungry animal that ate any good excuse on its way to thrive. He asked to speak to me in person. We sat on the bench outside the parish church where puddles reflected the stained glass like broken jewels. He looked tired in a way that suggested he had been carrying the weight of other people's expectations in both hands. "I wanted to do something honorable," he said. "Back then, Donovan said marriage would give Aaron a name and security. I thought marriage could fix things without anyone knowing. I convinced myself it was practical. But I'm sorry I said placeholder like that. I mean..." He stopped and rubbed his forehead. "I know it doesn't fix anything. You told me I was a placeholder in front of the whole town," I said. "Do you understand what that did?" He flinched. "I do. I was cruel, Hannah. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to fight back against my father. He is not a man who asks, he is a man who takes. I thought if I went along it would be less painful for everyone. That was wrong." "Why me?" he asked. "Why not? Why not find a way that didn't involve making me the cover?" "Because you were safe," he said, and I felt something inside me twist. "You were steady. You always kept your head down and took care of people. My father framed it like duty. It was easier to ask you than to ask you to shoulder ruin in another way." Meaning, he had chosen me because I was the family member most likely to accept sacrifice without protest. Felt used, battered. My first instinct, raw and animal, was to push him away so violently I would not feel anything. But then I looked at Aaron, who, in his scuffed sneakers and oversized hoodie, was watching us from the church steps like a small sovereign, and I remembered why I had said yes in the first place, because I loved this child enough to try to give him something steady. We spoke long that morning, words thick with blame and explanations that smelled of smoke. Mark was not a villain out of a novel. He was a man whose hands had been forced by a father who had been taught the same lessons of leverage and silence, and who had then taught them to his son. That pattern of abuse, economic, moral, and emotional, ran through our town like a hidden pipe that leaked poison. My father, when confronted later, muttered about pride and debts and survival in ways that sounded both like confession and excuse. "We did what we had to do," he said, which is another way of saying, "We chose our safety over your right to know." The same logic had been used by Lucy, Mark's father, and the people who make deals in corners where nobody checks the light bulbs. At the end of it, I stood in my kitchen one evening, alone, the smell of leftover wedding cake and coffee curling in the air, and felt like a puzzle piece someone had forced into the wrong slot. But pieces can be refitted. They can be taken out and placed where they belong. My anger began turning to something else. An examinable, slow planning. If my life had been used as a down payment, I would not let it be spent without being paid back in truth. "It will be messy," Father Thomas had said earlier, ever my unwilling accomplice in the slow demolition of lies. He'd told me to take space to breathe and not to respond to every whisper. "You have a choice now," he said, "and choices are where the living begin." So I began to make choices. I called a lawyer. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted the right paper trail to prove custody and to protect Aaron from being a bargaining chip again. I told Lucy that if she wanted a relationship with her son, she would have to accept the consequences of leaving and the slow work of regaining trust. I told Mark that if he wanted to be Aaron's father, he had to be one fully, not a name on a paper in a ledger. The legal process was less cinematic and more procedural than I'd imagined. You go to rooms with fluorescent lights and plastic chairs, sign forms, wait for mediators who have learned the cadence of familial destruction and use it to keep their own hearts intact. There were phone calls that rang like small alarms at 3 in the afternoon, and emails that required answers I didn't always have the courage to give. I learned how to say precisely what I meant, no more, no less, because lawyers require language to be a tool, not a weapon. Mark and I sat at a mediation table with a woman who had kind eyes and a clipboard that looked like it had catalogued the private grief of half the town. She asked us to list needs: Aaron's stability, his schooling, his psychological care. Mark was earnest in a way that made him almost pitiable. He wanted to do right, but he was also the product of a family that believed sacrifice could be outsourced. "I will take responsibility," he said. "I will be here for Aaron. I will sign whatever papers you need, Hannah. I don't expect you to forgive me. Do you love me?" I asked, the question bursting out of me raw and surprising. There it was. My vanity, my hurt, my genuine inquiry into whether my life had ever meant something real to him besides a solution. Mark looked at me, and for a second I saw indecision like a man standing at a crossroad with fog in every direction. I thought I loved you when I proposed, he admitted slowly, in the narrow places that feel like an option. But I think I loved the idea of someone steady. I admire you. I respect what you do. But I don't think I was in love in the way you need. I do not want to pretend. I want Aaron to have his father. I want you to be able to live without being used. We decided, with the mediator's guidance, to annul the marriage. The legal medicine that dissolves what never had the soil to grow. It felt like a strange mercy, both a relief and a wound dressing. Annulment doesn't wipe away the hurt of words shouted at the altar. You still have the pictures. You still have the memory of people staring like hungry birds. But it also makes clear, on a legal level, that what had been done was flawed at its root. Mark agreed to take custody responsibilities, visitations, contributions, weekends where he would be present for school projects, doctor's appointments, and a commitment to family therapy for Aaron if he would go. It felt practical, like scaffolding for a fragile structure. There was no grand reconciliation scene where love surged back. Instead there were talks in living rooms with coffee and paper forms. Lucy did not find it easy. She wanted to be forgiven quickly, as if absolution were a thing to be petitioned for. She wanted to slide back into the roles she had abandoned and be embraced. But the adults I had become pushed back. You left, I told her one night when the living room felt too small for the anger between us. You left him with me. You gave me the choice to raise him without knowing. You used me. I know, she said. Every night I thought of you, of Aaron. I couldn't sleep. I wanted to claw my way back, but I was ashamed. Shame is its own kind of disease. It eats the parts of you that ask for help. Lucy had been eaten by it, but there is a difference between being eaten and being a predator. She was broken, not evil. That distinction matters in the slow calculus of forgiveness. Therapy was not glamorous. Aaron hated at first the idea that he had to talk to a man with a degree, as he called the therapist. He thought it a waste of time. But eventually he began to use that room to sort through the loose coins of his feelings. Confusion, embarrassment, curiosity about a mother who left and a father who had been a name and not a presence. He asked, in the quiet way kids ask the big foamy questions, "Why did she leave me?" I taught him the word fear, and we had a long talk about how adults sometimes make decisions that are about their fear, not about us. Mark showed up for those sessions like someone learning to do the hard work of being present. He was clumsy sometimes, forgetful about school plays and awkward presence at parent-teacher meetings, but present in a way none of us had insisted upon previously. It was small and imperfect, but it was an honest offering. He didn't sweep me off my feet, and he didn't need to. I began to see him as a father who wanted to be better rather than a husband who had used my life as a ledger entry. Outside of our private arrangements, the town continued to murmur. People who had once congratulated me were now curious about how I'd allowed the deception. Here is one of the cruel paradoxes. People insist on the clean story. Someone to blame, someone to pity. They prefer narratives with villains and saints. Real life is messy. It is stitched with human motives that are rarely purely malevolent or purely innocent. There were nights I cried until my throat ached. I would stand in the kitchen and press my palms to the cold sink and let the water run. The physicality of grief is important. The way your chest feels as if someone is taking a slow, unrelenting grip. I slept less, wrote more, and started a list of things I wanted for myself that did not involve being a cushion for someone else's mistake. Have you thought what you want? Father Thomas asked me once as we sat under the church's dim lamp. I told him I wanted a clean life for Aaron, a small house where he could grow up without the smell of deals in the corners. I told him I wanted to sleep through the night sometimes. He nodded and didn't offer platitudes. Instead he told me to be as gentle with myself as I had been with Aaron. Forgiveness did come, Not in one great wave but like a tide that returned in increments. I forgave Lucy for being human and for the fear that had moved in her like an animal. I forgave Mark in small pieces when he showed up for parent-teacher conferences and when he looked at Aaron with a softness that had not been there before. Forgiveness did not mean silence about harm. It meant speaking the truth and then choosing not to be defined by it. I found a new rhythm. I started volunteering at the community center helping kids with homework. I learned how to make my own mortgage payments without old family figures hovering like vultures. I dated briefly and poorly, the way people do when they are still carrying a suitcase of baggage. I learned to recognize the difference between someone who admired my caretaking and someone who wanted to take it for granted. There is a small, sturdy kind of joy in rebuilding. It is practical and mundane and often unseen. It is making dinner for a child and then letting him go to a friend's house and not feeling the need to tidy up emotional loose ends. It is buying a potted plant and keeping it alive. It is showing up when you say you will and insisting that others do the same. The laws and papers were part of the scaffolding, but the work of repair was a quieter, longer labor. If this has touched you, if you're thinking about how to start putting yourself back together after a betrayal, remember. Small steady acts of care add up. Sometimes the bravest thing is to keep showing up for the person who depended on you. If you want to hear how it turned out, don't forget to subscribe. There are more chapters one haven't shared yet.